The morning was alive with the usual noise of the city, but for some reason everything seemed louder that day. The streets were crowded with people rushing to their jobs, buses were packed, and car horns echoed through the narrow lanes. In the midst of all this, a young man walked briskly, keeping his head down but constantly glancing over his shoulder. There was a tension about him, a nervous energy that made him appear cautious, even on edge. He clutched his bag tightly, and every now and then, he would pause and check his phone, hoping to find some distraction from the rising worry in his chest. Nearby, a police officer was on routine patrol, scanning the crowd with sharp eyes. He had been in the force for years, and his instincts had grown sharper with each passing day. That morning, something about the young man caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way he moved or the way he avoided eye contact with others. Whatever it was, the officer felt a rising suspicion and decided to approach. His steps were deliberate and measured, but there was a firmness in his stride that spoke of authority and a readiness to act if needed. As the officer drew closer, the young man sensed someone was following him. His pace quickened, but he didn't run. He knew running might make the situation worse. He tried to keep calm, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong. Still, the officer's presence was imposing. There was no smile, no friendly gesture, just a stern, watchful gaze that seemed to read every small movement as a potential threat. People around started to notice the interaction. A few paused on the sidewalk, their curiosity piqued. Some looked away quickly, not wanting to get involved. The city was full of strangers, and most preferred to keep their distance. The young man stopped at a street corner, hoping to gather his thoughts. He tried to explain something to the officer, but every word seemed to bounce off the tension that hung in the air. The officer's voice was firm, and the questions came quickly, almost as if he were trying to catch the young man off guard. The crowd felt the change in energy. A few bystanders whispered to each other, sensing that the situation might escalate. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that made people take small steps back. Some reached for their phones, ready to call for help or record what was happening. Others simply watched, unable to look away from the unfolding scene. In the midst of this, a figure emerged from the crowd, moving with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. He wasn't in a rush, and yet his eyes were focused, taking in every detail. He noticed the young man's nervous glances, the officer's stern posture, and the hesitant steps of the bystanders. There was a familiarity in the way he observed the situation, a trained awareness that allowed him to anticipate what might happen next. This man was John Cena, though no one around yet realized who he was. He had been in the city for a charity event, enjoying a quiet morning walk before his busy day began. But the sight before him immediately drew his attention. Cena's presence was calm, almost unnoticeable, but his mind was racing. He had seen many situations like this before, both in public and in his professional life. He understood the importance of timing, of knowing exactly when to intervene and when to let things play out naturally. He noticed the young man's subtle attempts to keep his hands visible, the slight tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes darted around, seeking escape routes. Cena could tell that the young man was scared but not dangerous. The officer, however, seemed ready to assume the worst. The young man tried again to explain himself. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of fear underneath. He gestured with his hands, hoping to communicate that he meant no harm. The officer, however, seemed to misinterpret every gesture. His responses were quick, his tone sharp, and his movements deliberate. The young man's heart raced, and he felt a tight knot in his stomach. He wished someone could step in, someone who could calm the situation before it got out of hand. Cena continued to observe, analyzing every movement. He noticed the small details that most people would miss, the way the young man's bag was slung over his shoulder, the nervous tapping of his foot, the slight shaking of his hands. Cena understood that fear could easily be mistaken for guilt, and that assumptions made in moments of tension could lead to mistakes. He stayed in the background, waiting for the right moment to make his presence known. The officer took a step closer, his voice rising slightly as he demanded answers. The young man's eyes widened, and he took a careful step back. The crowd instinctively moved a little further away, creating a small circle around the confrontation. The energy was thick with anticipation, and it felt as though the city itself had paused to watch. The young man felt trapped, caught between the officer's authority and the uncertainty of the growing crowd. Cena adjusted his position slightly, making sure he had a clear view of both the officer and the young man. He noticed the subtle signs of frustration in the officer's posture, the tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the quick movements of his hands. Cena knew that if things weren't handled carefully, the situation could escalate quickly. He thought about the young man's fear and how it could be magnified by the officer's aggressive approach. He also thought about the officer, understanding that he was likely trying to maintain control and do his job, even if his methods seemed harsh. As the minutes passed, the tension grew. The young man's breathing became slightly heavier, and his movements more cautious. The officer's tone remained sharp, and his questions came faster. The bystanders continued to watch, some whispering to each other, others silently hoping for a peaceful resolution. Cena remained calm, his presence a silent reassurance that someone capable was aware of what was happening. He stayed patient, knowing that timing was crucial and that a single wrong move could change everything. The young man tried to keep the conversation steady, answering questions clearly and politely. He maintained eye contact as best as he could, trying to show honesty and transparency. The officer, however, seemed unconvinced, his suspicion not easily eased. The situation was delicate, balanced on the edge of potential conflict. Cena continued to analyze, noting the small gestures and expressions that revealed true intentions. The crowd shifted slightly, sensing the possibility of escalation. Phones were raised, ready to capture whatever might happen next. The young man felt the pressure mounting, and his mind raced with thoughts of how to de-escalate the situation himself. He wished for someone to step in, someone who could command respect and authority without resorting to aggression. Little did he know that someone was already nearby, watching, waiting, and ready to act if necessary. Cena's thoughts were focused and deliberate. He considered the officer's position, the young man's fear, and the crowd's presence. He knew that his intervention had to be calm, measured, and authoritative. It couldn't come across as a show of force, but rather as a guiding hand to steer the situation toward resolution. He remained close enough to act quickly, but far enough to allow the officer to maintain his dignity and control. Cena understood that influence often mattered more than confrontation. Time seemed to stretch as the tension lingered. The young man continued to respond politely, his words careful and precise. The officer's suspicion lingered, and his gaze hardened with each passing moment. The bystanders held their breath, sensing that the outcome could swing either way. Cena's presence was the invisible anchor in the storm, steady and unwavering, yet unseen by all but those who looked closely. The young man's hope was fragile but persistent. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet fear clouded his thoughts. He wished for clarity, for John Cena had been walking quietly through the city, enjoying the calm before the day's events began. The morning air was crisp, and he could hear the hum of city life, from distant car horns to the chatter of people walking to work. He liked observing the little details, the moments that often went unnoticed. That morning, his attention was suddenly drawn to a tense scene unfolding a short distance away. A young man stood frozen, facing a police officer who moved with a rigid sense of authority. The officer's voice was sharp, and his hands gestured aggressively, pointing and demanding answers. The young man, in contrast, looked nervous but composed, trying to keep his hands visible and speak calmly. Something about the interaction felt off to Cena. He knew, without knowing all the facts, that this could escalate if handled poorly. Cena slowed his pace, walking toward the scene but remaining inconspicuous. He didn't want to draw attention to himself yet, not before he had fully assessed the situation. His eyes scanned the officer's posture, the young man's subtle movements, and the crowd that had begun to gather around them. There was a mixture of curiosity and caution in the onlookers, a quiet tension that suggested everyone was aware that something significant might happen at any moment. Cena understood the power of presence. Sometimes just being nearby, calm and confident, could shift the energy of a tense situation. The young man spoke again, his voice steady but laced with anxiety. He gestured slightly, trying to explain something, but the officer seemed uninterested in listening. Cena noticed the officer's narrowed eyes, the tightness in his jaw, and the rapid movements of his hands. It was clear that the officer was not only suspicious but frustrated. Cena recognized that frustration could cloud judgment and make a small misunderstanding grow into something far more serious. He remained patient, carefully choosing when and how to intervene. The crowd continued to watch, some whispering to each other, others holding back as if they didn't want to become involved. A few people were already recording on their phones, sensing that whatever happened next might be important. Cena noticed this and understood that public perception could also influence how the situation unfolded. The officer, likely aware of the eyes on him, seemed determined to maintain control, though his methods were escalating tension rather than calming it. Cena took a subtle step closer, positioning himself so that he could intervene if necessary, but without making his presence too obvious. He observed the young man's micro-expressions, noting the flicker of fear in his eyes and the slight tension in his shoulders. Cena understood that fear often made people appear suspicious, even when they were innocent. He also recognized the importance of body language and tone. The young man's words were calm, but his body spoke a different story, one that could be misread if not seen in context. The officer raised his voice, and the young man flinched slightly. Cena saw the moment of hesitation and knew this was the critical point where intervention could prevent further escalation. The young man tried to explain again, his hands moving slightly, a gesture of honesty and openness. The officer's response was immediate and sharp, interpreting the movement as defensive. Cena stepped forward a fraction of a step, just enough to signal presence and authority, though he still remained quiet, letting the officer believe he had the situation under control. The young man's breathing became a little faster, and Cena could feel the anxiety radiating from him. He considered what to say if he needed to speak up, how to calm the officer without challenging his authority, and how to reassure the young man simultaneously. Cena's experience taught him that timing and tone mattered more than words. A calm, steady presence often diffused tension more effectively than arguing or shouting. The officer's gaze shifted slightly, scanning the crowd, though he did not yet notice Cena. The presence of onlookers added pressure, but Cena knew that he needed to act with subtlety. He could not appear to challenge the officer directly, yet he also could not allow the young man to be unfairly judged or treated. Cena's mind worked quickly, analyzing the energy of the moment and planning the sequence of his movements. Every second counted. The young man continued to speak, trying to clarify his actions and intentions. His words were logical and sincere, but the officer's tone remained accusatory. Cena observed the pattern, noting how the officer's assumptions were influencing his reactions. He realized that the officer was ready to escalate if provoked further, and that intervention was essential, not just for the young man's safety, but for the potential impact on everyone nearby. Cena stayed patient, knowing that a sudden move could either help or harm the delicate balance of the situation. Cena noticed a small child in the crowd, holding her parent's hand tightly, watching the interaction with wide eyes. He understood that fear and tension could affect everyone, not just those directly involved. The young man seemed aware of the growing crowd and was clearly trying to remain composed, though his nervousness was palpable. Cena considered how his intervention could reassure both the young man and the onlookers, demonstrating that calm and control were possible even in tense circumstances. The officer shifted his stance, taking a step closer to the young man. Cena could sense the slight increase in aggression, the subtle signs that the situation was about to escalate physically. The young man raised his hand slightly, a universal gesture of non-threat, but the officer misread it, leaning forward with a sharp tone. Cena decided it was time to make his presence known, but he did so with careful control, ensuring his voice would not startle or provoke. He approached with measured steps, projecting calm and authority without intimidation. As Cena drew closer, he subtly made eye contact with the officer, who finally noticed the man moving into the scene. The officer's posture stiffened slightly, a mixture of curiosity and caution. Cena spoke softly but clearly, ensuring that both the young man and the officer could hear him. His words were neutral yet commanding, acknowledging the officer's authority while also providing a calm perspective on the situation. The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly at the sound of the friendly, composed voice, realizing he was not alone. Cena's presence had an immediate effect on the energy of the scene. The officer's tone softened a fraction, and the rapid tension in the young man's body began to ease. Cena continued to stand between them, projecting a sense of balance and control. He observed the subtle changes in body language, the officer's slightly lowered hands, the young man's easier breathing, and the gradual shift in the crowd's demeanor from anxious curiosity to cautious relief. Cena's calmness acted like a silent anchor, providing stability in the middle of the brewing storm. The young man managed a small nod of appreciation, still careful not to draw attention or overreact. Cena noticed, offering a reassuring smile, though small and discreet enough to convey support without becoming the focus. The officer seemed to reconsider his approach, taking a step back and allowing the young man to explain his situation more fully. Cena stayed attentive, ensuring that the interaction remained safe and respectful, ready to intervene again if necessary. The crowd began to relax slightly, sensing that the tension was diminishing. A few people whispered in awe, recognizing Cena's presence, while most simply felt an unspoken reassurance in the calm authority he projected. The young man continued to answer the officer's questions, his voice steadier now, and the officer's sharp tone softened further. Cena remained a quiet guide, observing every detail, prepared to act if the situation shifted, but hoping it would resolve peacefully. Minutes passed, and the city continued around them, the sounds of traffic and chatter resuming in the background. Cena remained vigilant, watching for any signs of renewed tension. He knew that even after a moment of relief, a misunderstanding could reign. The air was still charged with tension, even as the young man took a few cautious steps back from the officer. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some curious, some wary, and a few recording silently with their phones. He kept his hand slightly raised, a gesture of peace, trying to communicate without words that he meant no harm. The officer, on the other hand, still held a sharp gaze, his posture rigid, ready for any sudden movement. It was clear that neither side had completely relaxed yet, and one wrong move could reignite the unease that had been building for several minutes. John Cena had moved slightly closer, careful to keep his approach measured. He didn't want to startle the officer or the young man. His presence was calm, grounded, and confident, radiating a quiet authority. Cena observed every nuance: the young man's shifting weight, the slight tremor in his hands, the officer's tense jaw, and the rapid blinking that came from heightened awareness. Cena knew that in moments like this, perception often mattered more than reality. The young man's nervousness could be mistaken for defiance, and the officer's impatience could be read as aggression. Cena's eyes also scanned the surrounding crowd. People had begun to inch backwards slightly, unsure of whether to intervene, stay silent, or simply watch. He could sense the fear, hesitation, and curiosity mixing in the crowd, and he understood that any visible escalation could cause panic. Children clung to parents' hands while some adults whispered quietly, feeling the tension but unsure how to help. Cena recognized that his calm demeanor could subtly influence not only the two individuals directly involved, but also the larger group watching. The young man tried to explain again, his voice steady but laced with concern. He gestured slightly with his hands, indicating that he had nothing to hide and meant no harm. The officer, however, continued to interpret these movements with suspicion. His eyes narrowed further, his stance slightly shifting forward, and his voice raised in a tone that was meant to assert authority, but instead added to the pressure. The young man's heart raced, and he struggled to maintain his composure while answering clearly and politely. He could feel the weight of every onlooker's gaze and the potential consequences of even a small misstep. Cena assessed the situation carefully. He understood that he needed to intervene without appearing confrontational or overbearing. The officer was dedicated to his duty, and any perceived challenge could escalate the tension. Cena's approach needed to be subtle yet effective, guiding the officer toward calm and fairness while simultaneously reassuring the young man. He shifted slightly, positioning himself in a way that offered quiet support and created an invisible buffer between the officer and the young man. A brief silence fell over the street. The young man's words had paused, the officer seemed to hesitate, and the crowd collectively held its breath. Cena knew that timing was critical, too early, and his intervention could be dismissed or provoke resistance. Too late, and the young man might face unnecessary stress or confrontation. He remained alert, reading micro-expressions and listening carefully to the cadence of voices and the subtle changes in energy. The officer finally asked a direct question, and the young man responded with clarity and honesty. 10. I noticed the micro-changes in the officer's body language, slightly relaxed shoulders, a less rigid stance, but he also saw the lingering caution. It was progress, but the situation was still delicate. Cena stayed patient, maintaining his calm presence, ready to step in if the tension escalated again. He understood that a single word, gesture, or movement could shift the outcome in a positive or negative direction. The young man tried to maintain eye contact, signaling honesty and openness. The officer, though still suspicious, softened slightly, considering the explanations being offered. Cena could see the subtle interplay of emotions, the young man's relief, the officer's guarded trust, and the cautious curiosity of the crowd. The dynamic was delicate, balanced between conflict and resolution, and Cena knew that steady guidance was essential. From the side, a mother quietly pulled her child closer, whispering reassurances as the scene continued to unfold. Cena noticed these small human moments and understood their importance. Fear, tension, and curiosity weren't limited to the main parties involved. They spread to everyone nearby. By staying calm and collected, Cena could influence the entire environment, allowing the young man and the officer to navigate the interaction without unnecessary stress or misunderstanding. The young man began to explain a detail that had caused the officer's initial suspicion. His voice remained calm, but his hands moved slightly as he illustrated the point. Cena subtly adjusted his stance, ensuring that he remained visible enough to offer reassurance if needed, but not in a way that dominated the interaction. His presence alone acted as a stabilizing force, an invisible shield that allowed the young man to communicate without fear and reminded the officer that escalation was unnecessary. The officer's gaze softened just enough for Cena to sense that the intervention was taking hold. The officer asked a few more questions, now in a calmer tone, giving the young man a chance to respond fully. Cena noted the gradual change, the small steps toward mutual understanding, and the way tension ebbed from the young man's posture. This delicate shift was the turning point Cena had been waiting for, where patience and presence could guide the situation toward resolution. The young man explained the misunderstanding completely, showing through his gestures and words that he was not a threat, and that any assumptions had been based on miscommunication. The officer listened more attentively now, nodding slightly and allowing the young man to finish his explanation. Cena stayed close, offering reassurance through his calm demeanor, making it easier for both the officer and the young man to engage in respectful dialogue without fear. The crowd began to react subtly to the change in atmosphere. Whispering faded, and a few people relaxed their stance, sensing that the situation was moving toward a positive outcome. Children looked up at their parents, feeling the reassurance in their movements, and adults felt the tension ease slightly. Cena observed these small human reactions and knew that his steady presence had influenced not just the two individuals, but the entire environment. The young man's body language shifted as well. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed, and the anxiety in his movements lessened. He maintained his composure, speaking clearly and respectfully, and the officer responded in kind. Cena watched the transformation closely, aware that it was the result of patience, understanding, and calm intervention rather than any force or confrontation. The officer finally took a step back, allowing the young man to regain a sense of space and autonomy. Cena stayed nearby, not intrusive, but ready to act if necessary. The young man's relief was evident, though he remained cautious. Aware that the situation had been serious moments earlier, the officer now asked clarifying questions rather than accusations, signaling a willingness to understand rather than confront. Cena's subtle guidance had created the conditions for this shift, demonstrating the power of calm presence and careful observation. Minutes passed with careful conversation, and the young man continued to respond politely and confidently. Cena noticed the gradual change in energy around them. The crowd relaxed further, the officer's stance softened, and the young man's confidence grew. The potential for conflict had dissipated, replaced by mutual understanding and a cautious sense of relief. Cena remained vigilant, aware that even small misunderstandings could reignite tension, but confident that the situation was now moving toward a peaceful resolution. The young man offered a small nod of gratitude, acknowledging Cena's silent support. Cena returned the gesture subtly. Maintaining the beat, the city seemed to pause for a moment. Though the usual background noises of car engines, distant conversations, and the faint hum of buses continued on, the tension from earlier had not completely disappeared, but it had transformed into a more controlled energy. The young man now stood with a cautious ease, still aware of the officer nearby but feeling less cornered. His movements were slower, deliberate and careful, as he tried to show that he was not a threat in any way. The officer's posture had also shifted, less aggressive than before, yet he maintained his focus, ensuring that the situation was still under observation. John Cena remained quietly present, a calm figure in the midst of uncertainty. He noticed the micro-changes in both the young man's and the officer's body language. The young man's shoulders had relaxed just slightly, and his hands no longer trembled with the same tension. The officer, on the other hand, had softened his tone and made small adjustments in his stance, signaling that he was open to listening rather than simply asserting authority. Cena understood that these subtle shifts were signs that his presence was beginning to influence the outcome positively. The young man took a small, careful step backward, signaling a willingness to cooperate while still keeping a safe distance. Cena's eyes followed each movement, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing the young man to regain autonomy in the situation. The officer noticed the movement, and for a moment the two men looked at each other directly, the tension between them palpable yet contained. Cena recognized this moment as critical. It was an opportunity to further calm the interaction and prevent any lingering suspicion or fear from turning into confrontation. The young man began to speak again, carefully explaining a detail that seemed to have caused confusion initially. His voice was steady, polite, and measured. Cena could see the slight change in the officer's expression as he listened more attentively. The sharp edges of suspicion had softened, replaced with cautious consideration. The officer asked follow-up questions, now framed in a way that allowed for clarification rather than confrontation. Cena's presence had subtly influenced the tone of the conversation, creating space for understanding instead of conflict. As the conversation continued, the young man grew slightly more confident. His words were clearer and his gestures more natural. Cena could see the relief beginning to spread across his face, though he remained cautious. The officer, too, seemed to be recalibrating, allowing the young man to explain fully without interruption. Cena stayed alert, knowing that the transition from tension to calm required careful monitoring. One sudden movement or misread gesture could undo the progress made so far. The crowd around them, which had been watching with a mix of curiosity and concern, began to sense the change. The whispers quieted and a few bystanders relaxed their stances. Children held their parents' hands a little less tightly, and some adults exchanged quiet smiles or nodded to each other, acknowledging the shift in energy. Cena understood that these small human reactions reflected the ripple effect of calm and measured presence. Even though he was not engaging directly with the crowd, his composure influenced everyone around him. The young man continued to clarify his actions, pointing to his belongings and explaining the small misunderstanding that had caused the initial concern. Cena noticed how carefully he chose his words and gestures, each movement intended to communicate honesty and cooperation. The officer listened more intently, his body language indicating that he was beginning to trust the explanations being offered. The once tense street corner now had a different energy, one of cautious resolution and understanding, guided subtly by Cena's presence. Cena's eyes scanned the entire scene, taking in every detail. He noted the officer's slight lean forward, the relaxed positioning of the young man's feet, and the subtle easing of tension in the surrounding crowd. Each observation reinforced that the situation was moving in the right direction. Cena understood that his role was not to dominate the interaction, but to ensure that it remained safe and fair. His calm, steady presence was a quiet reassurance to everyone involved, allowing the young man to remain composed and the officer to maintain authority without aggression. The officer finally asked a question that allowed the young man to explain the misunderstanding in full. The young man responded clearly, his voice calm and sincere. Cena could see the relief in the young man's eyes as he realized that his words were being received without hostility. The officer's posture continued to relax, and his voice softened further, signaling that the interaction was nearing a peaceful resolution. Cena stayed vigilant, ensuring that the calm persisted and that neither side misinterpreted the other's intentions. The young man gestured toward a small item in his bag, explaining how it had contributed to the confusion. The officer listened closely, now asking questions for clarity rather than suspicion. Cena recognized that the situation had shifted from potential confrontation to constructive communication. The tension that had gripped the Street was dissipating, replaced by an atmosphere of understanding and cautious relief. Cena's steady presence had played a pivotal role, providing silent guidance and reassurance throughout the process. As the conversation continued, the young man's posture became more relaxed, his movements less guarded. Cena noticed how the young man's confidence grew with each clear response, his voice steady and respectful. The officer, now fully attentive and calm, acknowledged the explanations without further accusation. Cena remained nearby, observing the subtle human interactions that signaled resolution. He understood that these small shifts were the true markers of progress, more meaningful than any words alone. The crowd, sensing the change, began to disperse gradually. Some whispered among themselves, sharing observations about the calm presence that had guided the situation. Others simply moved on with their day, carrying with them the memory of how tension had been managed and diffused. Cena noted the human reactions around him, understanding that even those not directly involved could feel the impact of a peaceful resolution. The young man's relief was evident, though he remained cautious, aware of how close the situation had been to escalation. Cena stepped slightly closer to the young man, offering a subtle nod of reassurance. The young man responded with a small, grateful gesture, recognizing the quiet support without needing words. The officer continued his questions, now fully measured and patient, allowing the young man to complete his explanations. Cena observed every nuance, ensuring that the atmosphere remained calm and that neither party felt threatened or misunderstood. The delicate balance of authority and empathy was being maintained, with Cena's presence as the stabilizing force. Minutes passed and the young man's explanations were complete. The officer took a step back, signaling that he had accepted the clarifications and that the immediate tension was resolved. Cena remained nearby, vigilant but unobtrusive, ensuring that the young man could leave safely and that the officer could continue his duties without residual frustration. The street, which had once been thick with tension, now felt lighter, almost relieved. The energy of the moment had shifted from potential conflict to understanding and calm. The young man finally took a deep breath, a clear sign of relief, and began to walk away slowly, still aware of the officer but no longer feeling cornered. Cena observed, making sure that his departure was safe and uneventful. The officer remained composed, having regained control over the situation without aggression. Cena's presence had allowed both parties to navigate the interaction successfully, transforming a potentially volatile moment into one of clarity and understanding. The crowd continued to disperse with quiet conversations about the unusual calm and authority that had guided the scene. Some people glanced back, curious about the figure who had subtly influenced the outcome. Cena allowed the young man to move away before blending back into the flow of the city himself, his presence unnoticed by most but felt by everyone involved. The morning, once heavy with tension and uncertainty, had ended with resolution, calm, and a sense of human understanding that would remain with those who witnessed it. Cena walked quietly along the sidewalk, reflecting on the small but significant impact of his intervention. He understood that moments like these required patience, observation, and empathy, and he was satisfied knowing that a potentially harmful misunderstanding had been prevented. The young man continued on his way, a little shaken but grateful, while the officer resumed his patrol with a renewed sense of awareness and measured judgment. The city moved on, oblivious to the quiet heroism that had just unfolded. But for those involved, the morning had been forever changed by one person's careful, human-centered presence and understanding. A lance of presence without drawing attention away from the interaction. The officer, now calmer, allowed the young man to finish explaining, and the conversation flowed more smoothly. The street, once tense and heavy with uncertainty, began to feel lighter, as though the calm authority of Cena's presence had created a ripple of relief throughout the scene. As the young man stepped back and the officer continued his questions calmly, Cena stayed attentive, ensuring that the resolution continued naturally. He observed the small cues in body language, tone, and expression that indicated understanding and cooperation. The young man's confidence continued to grow, and the officer's willingness to listen became more apparent. Cena knew that this moment of human connection and understanding was crucial, not only for those directly involved, but for everyone who had witnessed the scene unfold. By the end of the interaction, the officer's tone had shifted entirely. The sharpness had disappeared, replaced by a measured, fair approach. The young man's tension had eased, his gestures relaxed, and his breathing steady. Cena allowed himself a small internal nod of satisfaction. He had guided the situation without confrontation, using presence, patience, and observation to create understanding and calm. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to disperse slowly, talking quietly among themselves about what had happened and marveling at the quiet authority that had changed the course of the situation. Cena remained for a moment longer, ensuring that the young man was safe and the officer had regained composure. Then, without fanfare, he stepped back into the flow of the city, blending into the crowd once more. The young man walked away, a mix of relief and gratitude evident on his face, while the officer continued his patrol, a little wiser and more aware. The morning, which had begun with tension and uncertainty, ended with understanding, calm, and the quiet impact of one person's presence who had the experience, empathy, and timing to prevent an unnecessary confrontation. Quickly. He stayed, calm, patient, and ready, ensuring that both the young man and the officer had space to navigate the situation without fear or misinterpretation. The young man felt a growing sense of safety, understanding that someone competent and caring was nearby, ensuring he would not be unfairly treated. The officer finally asked his last question, and the young man answered clearly, without hesitation. Cena noted the subtle shift in the officer's demeanor. The tension that had dominated moments before was beginning to dissolve. The young man's shoulders relaxed, and he allowed himself a small sigh of relief. Cena remained attentive but did not intrude, letting the situation unfold naturally toward a peaceful resolution. He had created the conditions for calm and fairness without confrontation, guiding both parties toward understanding through presence, patience, and quiet authority. By the time the young man began to walk away, Cena had ensured that the officer had regained composure and the situation was fully under control. The crowd started dispersing, some exchanging quiet remarks about what had happened and others simply moving on with their day. Cena lingered for a moment, making sure that the young man was safe, then quietly slipped back into the flow of the city, blending in once more. The morning had been tense, but thanks to calm observation and timely intervention, what could have become a dangerous conflict had been resolved peacefully, leaving the young man unharmed and the officer able to continue his duties with awareness and understanding. And for someone to help bridge the gap between him and the officer. Cena recognized this unspoken need and prepared to step in at the exact moment when his presence could change the dynamic without causing further tension. He stayed, patient, confident, and ready, understanding that the right timing could prevent an unnecessary confrontation. Every detail mattered. Cena observed the officer's subtle shifts, the young man's micro-expressions, and the reactions of the crowd. He saw the fear, confusion, and hesitation that layered over the scene. The city noises faded slightly into the background as the focus narrowed on the unfolding interaction. Cena's mind worked quickly, evaluating potential outcomes, predicting responses, and planning the simplest, most effective way to diffuse the situation. The young man took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He spoke again, his voice calm but slightly shaky. The officer responded immediately, his tone questioning, but Cena could sense the rising tension behind the words. The young man's hands twitched slightly, a small signal of nervousness that could be easily misread. Cena recognized it instantly, understanding that fear and innocence could be mistaken for guilt and defiance. Cena's presence remained subtle, yet his focus was absolute. He was aware of every movement, every glance, and every change in energy. The young man's eyes briefly scanned the crowd, unaware of Cena's proximity, seeking any sign of support. Cena was ready to provide that support without overstepping, allowing the young man to remain composed while guiding the officer toward a calmer approach. The morning continued with the weight of anticipation hanging in the air. The young man and the officer stood facing each other, each interpreting the other's intentions with caution. The bystanders continued to watch silently, unsure of what would happen next. Cena remained vigilant, a quiet presence with the experience and insight to prevent escalation. The scene was tense, yet within it lay the potent,